Chicago, December 1919. As the train pulled into Union Station, 20-year-old Al Capone stepped onto the platform and into a world that would transform him from a scarred street punk into America's most notorious criminal.
What made Capone? Acceptance, really. What made Capone? The wink is what made Capone. After it was Prohibition that set him up. But after Prohibition, what houses of prostitution, brutishness, more or less fulfilling, as he would say, a public need. It's so funny about Capone. He's still remembered fondly by some. The same Al Capone had a bread line. If you remember him for the bread line, forgetting of all the brutishness and all those, not he knocked off, but the complete debasement of the human spirit. And so there's a fondness, there's a perversity here too, to Chicago. There's kind of a fondness for him, at least for the memory of him. They go, however, really.
The Chicago that greeted him was unlike anything he had ever seen. Where Brooklyn was cramped and dirty, Chicago sprawled endlessly across the prairie. Where New York's criminals fought over street corners, Chicago's underworld controlled entire neighborhoods, entire industries, entire political machines. Johnny Torrio was there to meet him, just as he had promised. But this wasn't the same Johnny Torrio that Al had known in New York. In Chicago, Torrio had evolved into something more sophisticated, more powerful, more dangerous. He wore expensive suits tailored on Michigan Avenue, drove a custom Packard sedan, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who owned pieces of the city itself.
Is the recognized legal method of testing the legality of imprisonment. Interested in law enforcement throughout this nation are assured that this particular menace to society will never be liberated until he shall have served the sentence of imprisonment which has been imposed.
As they drove through Chicago streets that first day, Torrio began Al's education in the art of big city corruption. "See that building?" he would say, pointing to an elegant office tower. "The city alderman who approved its construction owes us $50,000 from poker games. See that police station? The captain gets $500 a week to look the other way when our trucks pass by. See that church? Father Murphy takes confession from half our crew every Sunday, and he's never repeated a word of what he's heard." This was Al's first lesson in the Chicago way. Corruption wasn't just about bribing officials. It was about building relationships, creating dependencies, making yourself indispensable to the very people who were supposed to stop you. In Brooklyn, criminals fought the law. In Chicago, criminals were partners with the law. Their first stop was the Colosimo Cafe, the elegant restaurant that served as headquarters for James Big Jim Colosimo's empire. Colosimo was Torrio's uncle, a man who had built his fortune on prostitution, gambling, and labor racketeering. He was also, Al would soon learn, a man whose time was rapidly running out. Big Jim Colosimo was everything that the old-school Italian crime bosses aspired to be. He dressed like an opera star, complete with diamond-studded suspenders and gold teeth. He owned the fanciest restaurant on the South Side, where politicians and judges dined alongside prostitutes and pickpockets. He had married a beautiful opera singer and lived like a king. But he was also a man who couldn't see the future rushing toward him like a freight train. "Uncle Jim," Torrio said as they entered the restaurant, "I'd like you to meet Al Capone. He's going to be working with us." Colosimo barely looked up from his plate of pasta. "Another Brooklyn tough guy, eh, Johnny? What makes this one special?"
Somebody spilled the beans, and now Prohibition agents are spilling the beer. Thousands of gallons with plenty of kick. There's no doubt about it, the raid is a smashing success. Talk about showers, how'd you like to stand under this one? Before the raiders burst the doors and kegs, the brewery was turning out $5,000 worth of beer a day. At 25 cents a glass, this was 20,000 glasses per day. But now that day's gone forever. The foaming torrent is headed for the Chicago River, where the fish will inhale it free of charge. They say this kind of work makes even the agents thirsty, so sometimes they take time out to have a glass of water. But they manage to grin and bear it.
Torrio smiled knowingly. Al understands business, Uncle. He thinks before he acts, and he knows how to talk to people, all kinds of people. What Colosimo didn't understand, what he couldn't see even though it was staring him in the face, was that Prohibition was about to change everything. The Volstead Act would take effect in just a few weeks, and when it did, whoever controlled Chicago's liquor supply would control Chicago itself. But Big Jim was comfortable with his prostitution and gambling operations. He was making good money, living well, and saw no reason to take unnecessary risks. Torrio, however, had been planning for months. He had already established relationships with breweries, distilleries, and transport companies. He had identified the best smuggling routes from Canada and Mexico. He had mapped out distribution networks that could supply every speakeasy, hotel, and private club in Chicago. All he needed was someone he could trust to help him run the operation. Someone smart, ruthless, and ambitious enough to do whatever was necessary to succeed. That someone was Al Capone. For his first few months in Chicago, Al lived quietly, almost invisibly. He rented a small apartment on the South Side, far from the glamorous downtown hotels where Colosimo held court. He dressed conservatively, spoke little, and watched everything. This was part of Johnny Torrio's strategy. Let Al learn the city, understand the players, figure out how Chicago worked before revealing what he was truly capable of. Al's official job was as Colosimo's driver and bodyguard, but his real education was happening in the back seats of cars and the corners of restaurants where Chicago's power brokers made their deals. He learned which judges could be bought and which were truly honest. He learned which police captains would take bribes and which would have to be eliminated. He learned which politicians needed money and which needed favors. Most importantly, he learned which businessmen were ready to partner with criminals and which would have to be intimidated into cooperation. But Al was also laying the groundwork for something that none of Chicago's established criminals had ever attempted. A public persona that would make him not just feared, but admired. While other gangsters avoided newspapers and photographers, Al began cultivating relationships with reporters. While others ducked publicity, Al began to see it as a tool that could be used to his advantage. His first opportunity came in March 1920, just 3 months after Prohibition had officially begun. A fire broke out in a South Side tenement building, trapping dozens of families on the upper floors. By the time Al arrived at the scene, he claimed later that he had been driving by on business, the fire department was struggling to reach the trapped residents with their ladders and equipment. What happened next would become the first chapter in the Al Capone legend. Though, like many stories about Al Capone, the truth would become hopelessly tangled with myth and manipulation. According to the newspapers the next day, Al Capone had single-handedly organized the rescue effort, coordinating with firefighters, personally carrying children to safety, and using his own money to arrange temporary housing for the displaced families. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story with the headline, "Heroic Citizen Saves Dozens in South Side Fire." The article described Al as a successful young businessman who risked his own life to save his neighbors.
He is sentenced to 11 years in prison, but he is to be released 4 years.
To the man who enjoyed a little nip now and then, scenes like this were calculated to bring many a tear to a dry eye, not to mention a dry throat. And a new set of faces made the country's front pages. In New York, it was the Dutchman. This was the face that struck terror in rival mobsters. Dutch Schultz was not known for his gentle ways with the opposition. During the Roaring '20s, he and his mob kept New York City in a constant state of violence and bloody gunplay. In Chicago, it was Al Capone. That is, until the government caught up with him for tax evasion. Nobody was really deprived of drinking. We just went underground. The speakeasy became the hub of social life. And here was the gal who made her fortune by running one of the most famous of the illegal gin mills. Texas Guinan greeted her customers with the cry of "Hello, suckers," and people paid handsomely for the privilege of being insulted by Tex and her gals.
What the newspapers didn't report was that Al had been tipped off about the fire by a contact in the fire department, that he had brought photographers with him to document his heroic actions, and that the temporary housing he provided was actually a brothel owned by one of Colosimo's associates. The whole thing had been carefully orchestrated as Al's debut as a public figure, but it worked perfectly. For the first time, Al Capone's name appeared in the newspaper in a positive context. For the first time, Chicago's citizens had a reason to think of him as someone who helped rather than hurt his community. It was a masterclass in image management, and it was just the beginning. The fire rescue established Al's first key principle of public relations: always be the hero of your own story. No matter what illegal activities he might be involved in behind the scenes, in public he would always position himself as someone who helped people, who solved problems, who made Chicago a better place to live. But while Al was building his public image, Johnny Torrio was growing increasingly frustrated with Big Jim Colosimo's refusal to embrace the opportunities that Prohibition presented. Every week that passed without action was money left on the table, territory given up to competitors, chances lost forever. Torrio had tried reasoning with his uncle, tried showing him the potential profits, tried explaining how the alcohol trade could dwarf everything they had ever made from gambling and prostitution. Colosimo wouldn't listen. "I'm doing fine with what I got," he would say. "Why complicate things? Why take unnecessary risks? The authorities leave us alone because we stick to what we know." What Big Jim didn't understand was that in Chicago, standing still was the same as moving backward. While he refused to adapt, other criminal organizations were already moving into the alcohol trade. The O'Banion gang was establishing brewery operations on the north side. The Jenna brothers were setting up distilleries in Little Italy. Every day that Colosimo delayed gave his competitors more time to establish themselves, more time to build the networks and relationships that would be crucial once Prohibition enforcement really began. By early 1920, Torrio had made his decision. His uncle had to go. On May 11, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo received a phone call at his restaurant. The caller claimed to be expecting a shipment of whiskey that afternoon and needed Colosimo to come personally to inspect the quality. It was exactly the kind of call that should have made a careful man suspicious. Why would a whiskey supplier insist on dealing with the boss personally? Why the urgency? Why the secrecy? But Colosimo was excited by the possibility that his nephew had finally lined up a major alcohol supplier. Maybe Johnny had been right about the opportunities in bootlegging. Maybe it was time to expand operations after all. At 4:30 that afternoon, Big Jim Colosimo walked into the lobby of his own restaurant and found it empty except for a lone figure waiting by the coat check. The figure approached him calmly, said, "Hello, Jimmy," and shot him twice in the head. Big Jim Colosimo was dead before he hit the floor. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone in Chicago's underworld knew exactly what had happened. Johnny Torrio had eliminated the one obstacle preventing his organization from seizing control of Chicago's alcohol trade. And while Torrio certainly planned the murder, many historians believe that he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. The man who actually killed Big Jim Colosimo, according to several reliable sources within Chicago's criminal underworld, was Al Capone. If this is true, and the evidence strongly suggests that it is, then the Colosimo murder represents a crucial moment in Al Capone's development as a criminal mastermind. This wasn't a crime of passion, like the gang fights of his youth. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made in anger or desperation. This was cold, calculated, strategic murder designed to achieve a specific business objective. But more importantly, the Colosimo murder was Al's first experience with the kind of compartmentalization that would define his double life for years to come. Within hours of shooting Big Jim Colosimo in the head, Al was back at his apartment, calmly eating dinner and reading the newspaper. The next morning he attended Colosimo's funeral, not as the man who had killed him, but as a grieving employee paying his respects to his former boss. At the funeral, Al played his role perfectly. He wept convincingly during the service. He comforted Colosimo's widow with apparent sincerity. He told reporters that Big Jim had been like a father to him, that Chicago had lost a great man, that he hoped the police would catch the killer and bring him to justice. This ability to shift instantly from killer to mourner, from predator to sympathizer, from the man who committed the crime to the man who condemned it, this was the psychological foundation of everything Al Capone would achieve in Chicago. He didn't just lie to other people, he temporarily convinced himself that his lies were true. He didn't just wear masks, he became the masks he wore. With Colosimo dead, Johnny Torrio immediately took control of the organization and began implementing his plans for dominating Chicago's alcohol trade. But Torrio was smart enough to know that he couldn't do it alone. The opportunity was too big, the competition too fierce, the logistics too complex for one man to handle. He needed a partner, someone he could trust completely, someone who shared his vision, someone who could handle the violence that would inevitably be necessary while he focused on the business and political aspects of the operation. "Al," he said less than a week after Colosimo's funeral, "I'm making you my number 2. Equal partners in everything we do. But I need you to understand something. From now on, we're not just criminals. We're businessmen who happen to work in illegal enterprises. We dress like businessmen, we talk like businessmen, we think like businessmen, and most importantly, we act like businessmen who care about our community." This was the moment when Al Capone's double life truly began. From this point forward, he would be 2 completely different people living in the same body. During the day, he would be Alfonso Capone, successful businessman and pillar of the community. At night, he would be Scarface, the enforcer who eliminated anyone who stood in their way. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took months of careful planning, strategic thinking, and methodical execution. First, Al needed to establish his legitimate business identity. Torrio helped him purchase a small furniture store on the South Side, nothing fancy but respectable enough to explain his income to tax authorities and provide a reason for his frequent meetings with various businessmen. The furniture store was perfect cover for Al's real activities. Customers who came to buy chairs and tables never suspected that the friendly, well-dressed young man helping them was simultaneously running one of Chicago's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The store's back room served as Al's real office, where he planned smuggling operations, negotiated territorial agreements with rival gangs, and ordered the elimination of anyone who threatened their business. But the furniture store was just the beginning. Al also established a modest charitable foundation that provided food and clothing to needy families on the South Side. He joined the local Chamber of Commerce. He donated money to St. Mary of the Angels Church and made sure his donations were prominently mentioned in the church bulletin. He sponsored a youth baseball team and regularly attended their games where photographers would capture him surrounded by smiling children. Every public appearance was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the image of Al Capone as a community leader who cared about ordinary people. When reporters asked him about his business interests, he would speak passionately about providing quality furniture to working families at affordable prices. When they asked about his charitable work, he would quote scripture and talk about his obligation to help those less fortunate than himself. Meanwhile, the real Al Capone was building a criminal empire that would soon dwarf anything Chicago had ever seen. By late 1920, the Torrio Capone organization controlled most of Chicago's South Side alcohol trade. They had established relationships with suppliers in Canada and Mexico, created distribution networks that could deliver liquor to any speakeasy in the city, and developed sophisticated methods for avoiding law enforcement. Their trucks moved through the city with impunity, their warehouses operated without interference, and their profits grew exponentially every month. But success brought new challenges. As their operation expanded, they inevitably came into conflict with other criminal organizations who wanted their own share of the alcohol trade. The O'Banion gang controlled the North Side and was expanding southward. The Genna brothers had established operations in Little Italy and were looking to grow. Smaller gangs throughout the city were forming alliances and planning their own moves into bootlegging. Chicago was heading toward a war that would determine who controlled the most lucrative criminal enterprise in American history. And Al Capone, the man who had arrived in the city just 1 year earlier as an unknown tough guy from Brooklyn, was about to become the most famous gangster in the world. But first, he had to complete the most important transformation of his personal life. Because even as he was building his criminal empire, even as he was planning for the violence that he knew was coming, Al Capone was also getting ready to become a family man. In December 1920, Al married Mae Coughlin, an Irish-American woman he had met at a dance hall on the North Side. Mae was everything that Al needed in a wife: beautiful enough to enhance his public image, intelligent enough to understand the nature of his business without asking too many questions, and strong enough to handle the pressures that would inevitably come with being married to Chicago's most notorious criminal. But Mae was also something more important than any of those things. She was completely separate from Al's criminal life. She had no connections to the underworld, no knowledge of his illegal activities, no involvement in his violent business. In Mae, Al found someone who could love Alfonso Capone, the furniture store owner, without ever having to know Scarface the killer. Their wedding was a perfect example of how Al was learning to manage his double life. The ceremony took place at St. Mary of the Angels Church, with Father Murphy officiating. The guest list was carefully curated to include legitimate businessmen, community leaders, and family friends, but no one who could be obviously connected to organized crime. The Chicago Tribune Society page covered the wedding as a charming story about a successful young entrepreneur marrying his childhood sweetheart. What the Society page didn't mention was that several of the wedding guests were carrying guns, that the honeymoon was paid for with money from illegal alcohol sales, and that the groom had personally killed at least one man in the past year. Al's marriage to Mae marked the beginning of the most sophisticated period of his double life. He was now not just a businessman and a criminal, but also a devoted husband who spoke lovingly about his wife to reporters and made sure she was featured prominently in newspaper photographs. When their son Albert was born in 1921, Al added doting father to his public persona. The birth of his son was particularly important to Al's image management strategy. Nothing humanized a public figure like being seen as a family man who loved his children. Al made sure that photographers regularly captured him playing with young Albert in the park, teaching him to throw a baseball, taking him to Cubs games at Wrigley Field. These images of domestic happiness helped offset the increasingly frequent newspaper stories about gang violence and criminal activity on Chicago's streets. But while Al was perfecting his role as loving husband and father, he was also preparing for the war that everyone knew was coming. The alcohol trade was simply too lucrative for Chicago's various criminal organizations to share peacefully. Sooner or later, someone was going to make a move to eliminate the competition and take control of the entire market. Al spent months preparing for this conflict, but not in the way that most people would expect. While other gang leaders were stockpiling weapons and recruiting muscle, Al was studying Chicago's political and business establishment, identifying who could be useful allies and who represented potential threats. He understood that the gang war would ultimately be won not just by superior firepower, but by superior political connections. This was another lesson he had learned from Johnny Torrio. Violence is only a tool, and like any tool, it's only as effective as the skill of the person using it. Random violence, uncontrolled violence, violence for its own sake. These things might intimidate enemies temporarily, but they also attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement and turned public opinion against you. Strategic violence, on the other hand, violence that served specific business objectives, violence that eliminated threats while sending clear messages to potential rivals, violence that could be carried out without obvious connections to its sponsors. This kind of violence could be incredibly effective at achieving long-term goals. As 1921 turned into 1922, it became clear that the uneasy peace between Chicago's criminal organizations was breaking down. There had been several minor skirmishes, drivers hijacked, warehouses burned, lower-level operatives found dead in alleys. Both sides were testing each other's resolve. probing for weaknesses, preparing for more serious confrontations. The war that would make Al Capone famous was about to begin, and when it did, the world would discover just how perfectly he had mastered the art of being two completely different people at the same time. Because even as Al Capone was preparing to unleash unprecedented violence on the streets of Chicago, he was also preparing to become the city's most beloved public figure. The man who would order the deaths of dozens of rivals would simultaneously be the man who fed thousands of hungry families. The man who would control Chicago through fear would also be the man that Chicago's children cheered at baseball games. The greatest performance in American criminal history was about to reach its climax, and Al Capone was ready for his starring role.